Welcome to Minnesota Legislative Report, the region's longest-running public affairs program. Legislative Report is a weekly review of activity at the state capitol featuring lawmakers from northeastern Minnesota. Most importantly, it's an opportunity for viewers to call or email their legislative questions and have them answered live on the air. Minnesota Legislative Report starts now.
Hello and welcome to Minnesota Legislative Report. I'm your host, WDSE News and Public Affairs producer Greg Grell. Minnesota lawmakers packed a lot of work into this past week as they prepared for their spring break. Among the bills passed was a minimum wage increase set to be signed into law by the governor on Monday. This afternoon, our viewers have an opportunity to find out where legislators stand on some key issues that are yet to be decided. You can call the studio with your questions by dialing 218-788-2844, or if that's long distance for you, call our toll-free number, which is 1-877-307-8762. You can also email your questions to askmlr@wdse.org. Now let's introduce the legislators who are joining me in the studio this afternoon. To my immediate left is Representative Mary Murphy, Democrat from Hermantown. Thanks for being here, Representative Murphy.
You're welcome.
And Representative Erik Simonson, also a Democrat from Duluth. And welcome back, Representative Simonson.
Thank you.
I think we'll start with the minimum wage increase because that was the bill that was passed this week, set to be signed tomorrow by the governor. Representative Murphy, quite a passionate debate on the floor this week regarding minimum wage. Talk a little bit about that bill and how it's going to change the minimum wage in Minnesota.
Well, the House passed the bill last year, and then it came back now, and it does have a time period. It's not all going to happen in one time period. It's going to be a gradual increase, and we still have training wages, and we have a differential between big businesses and little businesses, and it will rise with as the GP, the economy grows, right. So will the income grow, but that doesn't go into effect until 2018.
Talk a little bit, Representative Simonson, how this bill, it's if the business is under $500,000 annually, they're not impacted by the minimum wage increase, is that correct?
Right, they're held to the lesser amount, which I think was kind of a compromise, if you will. I think that's one of the concerns that the House did listen to and did address in the final bill that we passed. The bill that we passed last year, I think there was far more passionate debate when we passed that one than the one we did this past Friday, but I think that's primarily because of the number of changes that we made to the bill.
What's your opinion about raising the minimum wage? There's been a lot of argument that it's going to be hard for smaller businesses. Some people say some businesses might have to lay off workers, others might actually go out of business. What do you think?
Sure. Well, I think first of all, the argument that it's going to really negatively impact smaller business, I think that was listened to and we addressed that. There's no real data that shows that an increase in the minimum wage has resulted in a mass layoff or a mass going out of business type of scenario. I think most of us believe that this increase is relatively small, much needed, and frankly, it's really going to be dollars that are going to be put right back into the economy again. So I think, at least I certainly think that it's good for Minnesota and it's good for our lower wage earners.
Now they talk about the stepped increases. In other words, it's not going to go up to, I believe it's $9.50 an hour is the ultimate number, but that's going to happen over a couple of years' time. Is that correct?
Right. I think the first step is this August, and then the next step is get to $9.50 in 2016, I think is what the end result is.
And Representative Murphy, how does that compare to where we're at the federal minimum wage right now? Is that going to be a separate number than what Minnesota has?
I think this is going to be a little bit above the federal, but the federal can catch up.
And I think President Obama actually congratulated Minnesota for increasing. I think he's been hoping for a federal minimum wage increase as well. So, one thing that I've noticed this session, Governor Dayton keeps calling this the unsession. There's been a number of bills that have been passed, or there have been a number of bills passed that take care of old, outdated references in law. Can you talk a little bit about, Representative Murphy, what some of those bills have been?
Well, most every committee policy and financial committees went through the parts of the laws that they are subject to in their committees, and we pointed out the departments, the agencies had a suggested list, and then we reviewed the suggested lists of what the departments were willing to eliminate it, and there was some agreement and there were some not. And then we have passed 4 or 5 on the floor of the House already, and there's probably still 3 more to go, 3 more bills to go, which would eliminate, they say, a suggested 1,000 pages of law.
Try to make that law book a little thinner.
A
huh?
little thinner, I guess. I hope we're not making any mistakes.
Representative Simonson, can you talk about any specifics about what some of these bills have done, these unsessioned bills?
I actually carried a bill for DPS, an unsessioned bill, and it was really kind of interesting to read through there and consider some of the things that we were doing. And Representative Murphy's right. This is the type of thing that you don't want to move too fast on and just throw something away because it hasn't been looked at for a while. But some of these were really antiquated. For example, there was a statute on the books that says that you can't drive your car in neutral. Okay, and that's been there since 1937, and you know, technology has changed and automobiles have changed, and it's the type of thing that's just no longer necessary. We also have a provision in Minnesota law that allows for collector license plates once your vehicle hits a certain age and it's a certain style vehicle. Well, we had every one of those individual types of vehicles listed out in statute, which took up many pages of law. And now we've simply made it easier, and we referenced a national standard rather than try to list all those individual things. So I think it was a good exercise. You know, it was necessary, needed, but it's the type of thing I think that always is happening too. So it's not like it's not constantly happening in terms of revising and changing and things like that.
So I just learned something, because I thought that the collector vehicle was any vehicle over like 20 or 25 years old, but that wasn't true.
Not necessarily.
Okay, interesting. One other thing that got attention this week, it was the so-called legislator immunity bill, an old archaic law that was on the books back, I think, passed in the 1850s, actually, when Minnesota was just a state. Can you talk a little bit about that, Representative Simonson, what that legislative immunity bill was all about? And that also was a very passionate debate on the floor this week.
Sure. You know, and I think a lot of the debate was more about the process than the actual issue itself. I think we were all in agreement that what was trying to be accomplished made some sense, but there was a lot of concern about the process. But essentially, a group of students from, where were they from? Concordia. There you go.
In the cities.
Yeah, they as a project for their class, put together the language in this bill and brought it forward. And essentially what they were trying to accomplish was that legislators would not be immune from arrest for driving while intoxicated, which on face value makes a lot of sense and it sounds really good. But the fact of the matter is that we were never immune from arrest for a criminal act. And as we've been told now, the language in the current law essentially protects us from civil charges during the time that we're in session. And you can imagine there's some value in that, I think, but there's no real true immunity from criminal charges and from criminal acts. But I think there's a lot of concern about the process simply because there was a lot of accusations that were made without substance behind the accusations. So I think that's what the primary debate was about. But at the end of the day, you know, I certainly agree. We're not immune from something, and if there's a perception out there that we are, then we should fix that.
Representative Murphy, your comments on that. The debate got quite heated, especially by some legislators who really felt like they were being accused of something that they hadn't done.
Well, you have to remember that the people that were lobbying this are inexperienced at the legislature. In a way, and so maybe things were said that were inflammatory. from time to time. But it has been several years before since any legislator has been accused of driving while intoxicated. And so there was no evidences brought forth, although people said they saw someone. And it was just basic gossip kind of conversations that incited the legislators that had the most passion. We get a card as a symbol of our becoming a legislator. I don't know how many people know where their card is. I happen to know where my card is. But I have never, ever thought of using the card. It's a symbolic card that comes with, as Erik said, it started in England. And the card that the barrister held, or the member of parliament held. And then it passed down through, I don't know if United States congressmen have them or not, but somehow it comes to us every time we're elected. And it doesn't get us out of anything, or I think a member in this day and age would be a fool to try to bring it out. But it's there. And they're saying we shouldn't bring it out for intoxication or DWI or DUI. And frankly, I firmly believe, and I think everybody that's talked on the night that we discussed this, firmly believe that we shouldn't bring it out for any purpose. And if we had a council, the council certainly wouldn't advise us to bring the card out. And we are citizens, and we are subject to obeying the law, and we are not subject to try to get out of breaking the law, or making the laws correct. And nobody wants to be perceived as trying to break the law with a little card. And so it's a moot point. But we passed it, and I assume everybody's going to be happy and law-abiding.
And by passing it, it's basically saying that legislators don't have immunity is what
That's right.
What the bill was passed.
If the law is passed, the legislators are expected to obey the law, as everyone else is.
Just as they are today, under current law.
Exactly. Representative Simonson, you mentioned that maybe in some situations civil suits brought against a lawmaker, maybe it's what they call what's the word I'm looking for, a nuisance suit or something, maybe somebody just trying to harass a lawmaker because they're unhappy with the vote, whatever the circumstance might be. Is that something that gives you some leeway with?
Well, what I referenced was essentially what our House researcher has said the interpretation of current law is. Now, personally, I think that one would be a fool to try to use it in any circumstance, be it civil or criminal. And a lot of many of the reasons that I heard that why it was created in the first place and has existed all these hundreds of years is that to avoid the opportunity for, say, the governor to order the state patrol to detain Representative Murphy, who needs to be present on the floor for an important vote. And that's kind of the logic behind it, but personally, I guess I'd be good with, if I was being detained unlawfully, I guess I'd just as soon let that play out and see how that turned out. I think the card is really not necessary.
All right, well, you are watching Minnesota Legislative Report. Call in with your questions like some of our viewers have this afternoon. We'd be happy to answer them on the air. We have a call from Gary in Barnum, and this kind of goes back to the minimum wage debate a little bit, because some members of the legislature, some Republican members, said that the Senate building was horse traded for the minimum wage bill, so to speak. Gary from Barnum is wondering, will the new Senate building be put to use when the Senate is not in session, since it's a large investment? So maybe people need a little bit of an understanding what this building is all about. It's not going to be where you're doing where the legislature meets, but it's where the offices will be for the staff and some of the senators.
That's correct. And the Senate office building will be very much like the state office building for the House of Representatives that's in existence now. We didn't move into a new building. When the House was brought over from the House grew too big for the Capitol, and now the Senate has grown too big for the Capitol. The Capitol is being restored to serve with open spaces and public spaces as it was intended in 1905. The larger the Capitol is used for many purposes. The governor's office is there, the attorney general's office is there, the historical society has a function there, and the House has a function there, and the Senate has a function there, and the Supreme Court has a function there, and the people have functions there. And the people are much more involved in what's happening at the Capitol these days. And the people come down for their days on the Hill, and the days on the Hill could be as many as 8 or 10 groups of people coming in one day, and there just isn't room for them all, and there isn't bathrooms for them all, and there isn't elevators for them all. And so then they get very frustrated when they can't find who they're looking for, or they can't find a place to sit down and rest, or they can't find a place to meet whoever they're supposed to meet while they're there. So there has to be more public spaces. There also has to be an additional hearing rooms for the Senate, because the Senate doesn't have enough hearing rooms. And so it was determined last year that with the new functions, or the expanded functions for the public, and the expanded functions for the Senate hearings, that they would be better accommodated if there was a Senate office building. And that passed last year, but it didn't pass in the bonding bill, it passed in the Senate tax bill. Occasionally in history, Minnesota history, buildings have been in the bonding bill. But instead they chose to put it in the tax bill. And it passed the Senate and it passed the House. The Senate had hearings. The House did not have hearings on whether there should be a building last year. But the Senate did have hearings. And so the public had their opportunity to speak. This year, then there was one of the conditions was that the Senate approved it in the tax bill, and it came over in the tax bill, but the House would have their say by the House Rules Committee hearing the nuances about the building. And the House Rules Committee did have hearings. They've had two several hours in length hearings on the Senate office building. And the House pared it down from a $90 million project to a $76 or $79 million project. And the House also said that the parking ramp that was to go should wait until after the building was built to build it. So it's a $76 million project now rather than a $90 million project. And the Senate has agreed to the 76 or 79. I'm not sure which it is.
So even though it was in the tax bill last year, it still isn't completely a done deal because the House hadn't voted on it, is that correct?
The House Rules Committee has voted on it and sent it over to the Senate, and they have since agreed. So it has been agreed upon now at this time. But minority caucus in the House is saying that at the same time the Senate was voting on that, we were talking about minimum wage. So they tied the two things together.
Mm-hmm.
I think that it was a separate issue.
Sure. And Representative Simonson, just so viewers like Gary and Barnum have a better idea, what's going to happen now is that there's going to be more room in the Capitol for legislative business. The offices, the senators right now are in the Capitol, is that correct?
Some of them.
Some of them are? They'll have their own separate building.
The majority party senators and their staff are in the Capitol. Mm-hmm. And their media is in the Capitol. Mm-hmm. Now that with the Senate office building, all the senators will be together in one building, and the media will be in that building also.
And then
so the Senate is losing some space in the Capitol. Mm-hmm. And the governor's office is growing a little bit. The Attorney General's office is growing a little bit because a new stairway has to be put in and a new elevator has to be put in, and that's mostly where the Attorney General's space is. The House majority and minority will have 2 caucus rooms in addition to this House space that we already have.
Okay.
And so it'll be more fairly balanced between the users of the Capitol. And the public, there will be more public spaces, and there will be hearing rooms in the Senate office building. I think it's 3 or 4 larger hearing rooms than are in the House space or the Senate space at the present time.
Representative Simonson?
I think there's also some misperception out there that just because the legislature isn't in session, that the legislators aren't working. Every time that I go to my office during the interim, I see legislators there all the time. I'm down there at least once a week, and I'm sure Representative Murphy even more because she's a committee chair. And we also have full-time staff that run our offices that work there year-round. So there's a lot of things happening. Even though we're not in session, there's still a lot of work being done. So I don't want folks to lose sight of that.
And hopefully that helps clear up some of the misconceptions and questions about that Senate office building. One of the other issues that people are interested in, including Gary from Cloquet, he had a question about the bonding bill. But before we get specifically to Gary's bonding bill, Representative Simonson, the bonding bill was supposed to be unveiled this past week. Now, I don't know if that's happened or not, or do we know what's in the bonding bill, House, Senate? We know what the governor wants.
I think we did unveil that, didn't we? No, we didn't.
So,
okay.
Not yet.
We talked about
We
it.
were ready to unveil it, and then I believe we got word that it can be a little bit bigger.
Oh.
That can go up to $1 billion.
So when you come back from the
so
break, probably it'll be.
It got pulled back, and there was a couple other projects that were being considered that hadn't been considered then.
Okay.
Well, then we'll have to wait to answer Gary's question. Gary from Cloquet was just wondering if the bonding bill included the Big Lake Area Sanitary District.
It did at the last time. The last time we saw it, it did.
It'll likely be in then if the bill is larger. So
Yes.
So we'll see what happens through the process. Things can change.
Correct.
But another thing, Representative Simonson, that is happening is the supplemental omnibus tax bill, the second tax bill this session, includes the 0.05% Duluth sales tax that the mayor is asking for. That's in your district. A lot of that money would go to work. Talk a little bit about what that money would do.
Right. So the essentially it's what we in Duluth often refer to as the half and half tax. It was put into place a number of years ago, and the purpose was, well, first of all, it was a 0.5% tax on food and beverages, and then an additional 0.5% tax on lodging.
That's where the half and half comes
Correct. Lodging less than 30 days. And originally it was put into place to pay for the bonds used to build the deck and the Great Lakes Aquarium. And then the language in the law was that when the bonds were paid off, that the taxes would blink off and they would go away. And they got paid off quicker than we anticipated, which is good. And they did blink off about 2 years ago. I think they dropped off. Now, the mayor's plan and the city's plan to redevelop and kind of put a higher emphasis, if you will, on the western half of the city from about Wade Stadium going west. His plan is that, in order to do some of the improvements that they want to do, and we don't know exactly what they will be yet, but he's looking in the neighborhood of about $18 million in bonding. So he wanted to reinstate this half and half tax to pay for the proceeds for that. So that bill was passed out of well, it's in the House tax bill, and it's also in the Senate tax bill. It looks a little bit different than it did when it started, but essentially I think we put in some provisions that'll help them pay it off quicker, and therefore the tax could blink off sooner.
Does the governor support this? Is this likely to pass, do you feel, Representative Simonson?
I do think it's likely to pass. He certainly is supportive of what we want to do with it, and because we've got a specific plan of how we want to do that, and it's not a tax that goes on forever. Plus, it's also subject to local control. It requires the city council to pass an ordinance to put this tax in place.
And traditionally, the legislature has been pretty bipartisan on these types of things when it goes back to the local decision-making body. It seems like you often see measures like this for different communities, Representative Murphy, where they want to, increase a tax in order to build a new building or something like that.
That's correct, or else to fund something locally, infrastructure, some local infrastructure thing that's already there. Usually it's looked upon favorably. But sometimes it's harder to get it in. Proctor's been waiting for for a food and beverage lodging tax for several years now, and I hope to be down there this week to maybe clarify why Proctor's isn't moving a little bit. So when you hear that we're all on vacation, don't believe it, because there's still some work to be done. And there's still time before the end of the season, before the end of the session, that we could accomplish something more than what's already in the bills.
And Representative Simonson, you mentioned the blink on, blink off, or some people would call it sunsetting. Talk a little bit about how much money this would predictably or supposedly raise, and how long it would be, and do we know those numbers?
Well, let me think here for just a minute. We probably, to pay off $18 million, and again, it depends on, the numbers of revenue that come in.
Right.
But you're probably in the neighborhood of about 15 years
okay.
To pay that type of a bond based on past history. Now, that could go sooner, it could go a little longer, but the law won't specify the length. It'll just say until enough revenue has been generated to pay for the cost of issuing the bonds.
Okay, so it'll blink off once that amount
Correct.
is raised.
Correct.
All right, that's a good way of stating it then. And you are watching Minnesota Legislative Report. We're about halfway through this afternoon show, so call right now with your questions, like Karen from Duluth. Karen's question is, very interesting question, Representative Murphy, why are state legislators and their districts not in the phone book? Have any idea? Maybe that's a phone company question. The easiest way to find out your state lawmaker's phone number is to go to the House website or the Senate website. But Karen's wondering why that's not in the phone book.
My name and number is in the phone book?
In the white pages, not in the
in the
government
white
section.
pages.
Yeah.
Oh, why?
I think she's asking why the state legislators' office numbers and district information isn't in the phone book. That's probably not in the legislative control.
Some people don't we hardly even have some numbers in the phone book anymore because
Right.
so many people don't have landlines.
Right.
But I don't know.
Any comment on that?
It's a good question. I guess I've never thought about that, but that's an interesting question.
And I do have
It's not like we're hiding.
No.
the House Public Information number. If you do want to find out your lawmaker's phone number is 800-657-3550 is my understanding. 800-657-3550. That's the House Public Information Services phone number. They should be able to help you out there. So.
And I don't know, do you have an 800 number? I have an 800 number.
Go ahead. Why don't
Oh,
you
I
tell
think
people what
maybe
it
I
is?
don't know what it is.
You can't remember it off the top of your head.
I don't have it.
And I don't have
in
it
my
written down,
head.
so.
But I know I have an 800 number. So people don't have to pay their own dime.
Right, exactly. And there are toll-free numbers that you can call. Representative Simonson, Sue Ellen from Goodland has a question about Minnesota unemployment benefits. Are they going to be extended? Do we know about unemployment benefits? Is there an extension in the works?
In terms of state unemployment benefits,
She writes Minnesota unemployment benefits. So,
I have not heard of any
okay,
discussion about that outside of what's happening at the federal level.
okay. So it possibly could have meant the federal unemployment
That
benefits.
could be it. There's been a lot of discussion about that, of course.
Right, right. Representative Murphy, this week the governor signed a tougher anti-bullying law into effect. I think the legislature had passed an anti-bullying law. Now there's a tougher law. What brought that about? Why was that necessary?
It's a tougher law than the bill that we passed this last year, but it was also a better bill in that clarified some expectations. There were many more supporters of the bill as it came back to us from the Senate than when it went over to the Senate. The House passed the bullying bill last year, and as I said, it came back with tougher but more clarification, more understanding, and more supporters of it. And so the School Boards Association, the School Administrators Association, Education Minnesota, PTA, and other parental groups supported the bullying bill that passed this week. And I think that better than our former law, which was just one or two sentences law, there is also combined that the school districts have to have a policy in place that will tell what they will do when a case is reported to them. And there has to be training for all people that work with children on the school properties. There has to be some kind of training for anti-bullying procedures. And the children, as well as all those people that work with the children, have to have an understanding of the reporting process so that something can be done when something is reported.
And Representative Simonson, as I understand it, the local districts still have the ability to create their own bullying policies, but there are going to be certain mandated things that have to be part of that policy. Is that correct?
Absolutely. You know, local control was a big part of this discussion, and that certainly is there and available. And I would suspect that most school districts will take advantage of that and continue to do their own thing. As long as their policy is consistent with what's required by the state, we shouldn't have any problems. It's the districts that choose not to comply where the state will step in and create the policy for them.
All right. Jim from Hibbing has a question. What is the status of the medical marijuana legislation? And Representative Simonson, this has been an issue of contention. It's kind of gone back and forth a little bit. Where does it stand right now in your knowledge?
You know, back and forth is an understatement. This has been discussed, you know, kind of informally throughout the entire session. But what's the most recent thing, I guess, is that the Senate did have a hearing on the bill last week, I think, just last week. They did not take a vote on it yet. So that bill is still sitting in that Senate committee, and there's no indication if they will take a vote on it. And if they do, it still has to go to the full Senate floor. And we still don't, I think, have a really clear understanding of if what's in that bill would be supported by the governor. So I think there's still a number of steps between where we are today and the end result. And I'm pretty certain we're going to run out of time before we get there.
And I know the supporters are still pushing for something for this session, but we are getting down to the wire now. So,
And there's really a difference in the communications that are coming through to us of what supporters really mean. There are people that want medical marijuana because of pain for themselves or their pain relief for themselves or their children. But there's also people that think that medical marijuana is any kind of marijuana. And they're all for that. There's no answers to the questions that I've asked, and that is, does the manufacturer, if there is a medical marijuana, what is the prescription or what is the formula for medical marijuana as opposed to other kinds of marijuana? Can it be manufactured somewhere else and delivered to us across state lines? And if that occurs, are we breaking the federal law? Are people that would subscribe to receiving medical marijuana federal lawbreakers? Does Minnesota have to adopt a procedure for manufacturing and prescribing the medical marijuana to the people that have a need for it? And if so, who determines which people have the need for it? Is it a medical person? Is it a nurse practitioner? Is it a physician? Or is there a certain kind of marijuana medical person or scientist that determines? And there's very little discussion about those kind of things. And I'm very cautious about that we're still breaking federal law if Minnesotans are allowed to do this.
So a lot of questions yet on this bill, and we may hear more before the end of the session, I'm sure. Jim from Hibbing also had a question. He obviously was hearing our conversation about the Senate office building, and he had a specific question about the office building. Representative Murphy, do you know, is there a swimming pool, a fitness center, or other amenities like that planned for the building?
Unfortunately, originally, there was a fitness center, but because that was seen as a frill, they took that out. Now, personally, I think any building that people, where they have such intense work going on, need a little place where they could go and run around a track, or they could do some fitness in. But no, there is no fitness center. There is no swimming pool. There is no arboretum, or there is no fancy places for park inside the building. There is no extensive landscaping. We brought it down from the $90 million down to the $79 million, and it is office spaces, hearing rooms, public spaces, and employee workstations.
So a pretty basic office building.
Pretty basic office building. If you look at the most basic office building in the Capitol complex, it is the Centennial Building, and it's more dour than that.
Well, and there's been some people complaining about the architecture, but that's a whole other story. We won't get into that today. That's more subjective. So.
But it is not shiny, and it is not palatial.
All right.
So thanks, Jim. Thanks for asking.
All right. Representative Simonson, I'll let you answer this first, and I'm sure Representative Murphy will want to respond as well. But this week, the Women's Economic Security Act passed the House. And that is a bill that's aimed at kind of leveling the playing field for pay between men and women and some other issues. Talk a little bit about that bill and what's in it.
Right, you know, that's a pretty exciting piece of legislation, really. That bill should go down in history and be remembered for a long time, I think. But what really impressed me about that entire process is how it came to be and how it came together. I don't remember how many individual authors there were that started out. 9, was it?
I think so.
Yeah, so 9
Some
individual
different ideas that came together.
components, different bills that started through the committee process and came together in kind of this mass omnibus bill that really does a lot of really good things. And you know, I think a lot of the things that are in there are things that are being done across Minnesota, but there are so many places where it's not being done, and therefore it's not fair. For example, I think it extends the leave benefit for maternity leave from 6 weeks to 12 weeks. It provides for employers to provide space for women to do, you know, nursing and things like that. And it provides for just basic equal opportunity. And I think it's a really good bill, and it was a really good process, and it was exciting to be a part of that.
And Representative Murphy, what's your opinion about that bill?
I totally agree with what Representative Simonson said. And in addition, there was a small, a study is being required by someone, MMB. Someone has to find out about the number of people in the state that do not have access to pensions. And I think that's a very important thing. We know pretty much how many public employees have pensions, but there is a growing number of people throughout Minnesota that we're finding out do not have access to pensions other than Social Security. And this study is going to hopefully bring us the numbers more. We will know the numbers, and so we can plan for in the future for how are those people going to live when they're past work age.
And maybe we should clarify that, because some people will think of a pension as a publicly subsidized. You might be meaning really like a retirement plan, like a 401k or a 403b.
Correct. Yes.
Not a government funded, but
yeah.
access to a retirement plan
Yes.
that they can contribute to, maybe get some matching from their employer.
And how many people, for a long time we assumed everybody had something. Everybody had, every working person in Minnesota had access to some kind of pension, but that's not true any longer. And we want to know who have access and who doesn't have access, and if they don't, what can be done either privately or publicly to alleviate the situation. But since we don't have a clue how many Minnesotans are without or have no savings toward retirement years, this is the first step. This study is the first step toward that.
And Representative Simonson, if I'm not mistaken, this bill also has some requirements. If a business gets funding from the state, they have to show that men and women in equal jobs get equal pay. So there are some other parts of this bill that will kick in.
They do, and that threshold is actually really high. I think it's $500,000 is the threshold. So if you're a business that has a state contract for $500,000 or more, yes, you will have to prove that, you know, the policies that you have in place do meet the requirements of this statute.
All right. We got a call from Richard from Duluth, and Representative Murphy, Richard's is wondering, has there been or is there talk of seniors getting discounts on things like state park fees, fishing and hunting licenses? I thought there were some senior discounts for hunting and fishing licenses. Maybe it was just talked about and not passed.
There were, at various times, there have been some discounts, and there were, and then they were taken away.
Oh,
and
okay.
so there hasn't been any talks lately about.
And I believe there are some lifetime licenses as well, where you can pay one fee and then you have a license for the rest of your life.
Right.
So, but as of right now, no senior discounts as far as you're aware of.
That's no new ones.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. We talked a little bit about this 2 weeks ago, Representative Simonson. I'd like to bring it up again, though. The bill that's been working its way through the House regarding domestic abusers and guns, the not being able to have a gun in the household. Can you talk a little bit about that and where that is at right now?
Well, it's sitting on the general register. I would suspect that if it's going to be taken up, it'll obviously be done when we go back. I think it's a good bill. I think that they've done a lot of work bringing the parties together. The key is with this type of legislation is that you want to make sure that what you're doing is fully understood so that we don't get this misperception that we're attacking rights that we're really not. And this is the type of bill that would provide for protection to both parties to a domestic abuse situation. And it only would apply when convicted. It wouldn't apply prior to that. And it would allow the individual that was giving up their firearms to choose where to put those firearms. And they would have options to turn them over to law enforcement if law enforcement would accept them. They can give them to a third party, or they could turn them over to a federally licensed firearms dealer. And then at some point in time in the future, they would, when the judge allows, they could have access to their weapons back.
So it's not a lifetime ban necessarily?
Not necessarily, no. And I think they've done good work in trying to bring all sides of this thing together, and hopefully it's something that we can pass, because we do know that in domestic abuse situations, if there's access to a firearm, at the time something really bad happens, oftentimes that firearm gets used. So it does make a lot of sense, and we do think that it's a good domestic abuse strategy.
Representative Murphy, you sit on the House Legacy Committee, which doles out the legacy funds and oversees the legacy money. That's the tax that was passed a couple of years ago. Talk a little bit about what that committee is doing this year, and if there's any measures that the viewers might want to know about.
The Outdoor Heritage Fund was the only one that we dealt with this year.
Lessard-Sams?
Lessard-Sams. Because all the other funds are appropriated for 2 years. And so that passed the House of Representatives this week also, and there were no changes. The recommendations of the Lessard-Sams Outdoor Heritage Fund recommendations were upheld.
And I read that there was about $109 million in that for conservation projects. So maybe, I don't expect you to name them all, but give people an idea of what kind of projects get funded by this bill.
Well, one of the projects was the return to the Fond du Lac community band of American Indians, the land that had been part of the 1854 treaty. And so they are purchasing this land, and the Fond du Lac band will be turned over to the Fond du Lac band for management.
And I think maybe people...
And there's some other projects that will clean up rivers, and there's some land purchases in there. Most of the land purchases are in southern Minnesota and the prairie lands, that kind of thing. But they were all projects that were vetted by the Lessard-Sams Outdoor Heritage Council and came to consensus and agreement.
And that council is separate from the legislature, right? They make recommendations that the legislature will then put into statute. Is that how that works?
That's correct, but there are, I think, 4 legislators on the council.
Okay.
2 in the Senate and 2 from the House.
All right, we have just about 10 minutes or so left, so we have a few more questions to get to. Representative Simonson, talk a little bit about transportation. You sit on the Transportation Policy Committee, and we haven't heard a lot about transportation this session. Is there any measures coming through that viewers might want to know about?
You haven't heard a lot, but we've certainly been talking about it a lot. I think our transportation bill this year is relatively small, in the neighborhood of $50 million, I think was the target that we ended up passing. But the reality is that there's a lot of discussion about what we're going to do next year for transportation, because there's a huge need statewide, whether you talk about roads and bridges, or you talk about transit funding, or you talk about local need, or you talk about the lack of or the reduction, I guess, in funds from the federal government. We just have this significant hole in Minnesota that needs to be filled somehow. No pun intended, but so I think next year what we really need to do, and what the policy committee is talking about, is we need to have a plan to go forward with, and this will be a big one because there is a significant shortfall just in funding for state roads and bridges to the tune of about $12 billion over the next 20 years. And that's not going to be covered by just a 5-cent gas tax. Okay, so we really need a comprehensive funding package going forward, and we also need to be recognizing the fact that local governments have significant transportation needs too, and how does that factor into the equation?
Now, I read that some of that extra money from the budget surplus this year is going, though, to help communities or highway companies, or I shouldn't say highway companies, but the transportation department, fix potholes, do some minor repairs.
Yeah, I think that was $15 million or somewhere in that neighborhood.
Which sounds like a lot, but that doesn't go very far for highway repair, does it?
Right. It will fill some potholes. That's exactly what it was intended to do. But it sounds like a lot of money, and it is a lot of money to you or I or to the average person, but when you apply it statewide and try to do some work, it doesn't go very far.
One other issue that's going to be getting a lot of attention in our region, and has already, but that's the Highway 53 relocation project. Is that something that the legislature or the transportation committees have been talking about? I know that's going to cost quite a bit of money, and the state basically is over a barrel. They have to do it. So.
Right. Yeah, we talked about that a lot last session, not so much this session, but last session we looked at a number of different options. And I know our range delegation was heavily involved in trying to come up with the best solution based on the community need, as well as what the state wanted to do. But I haven't heard a lot more discussion about it this year.
We have to ensure that Minnesota gets their proportionate amount from the federal government for projects, and sometimes it seems like it's harder and it's becoming harder and harder to get the federal money. And,
is that matching funds in some ways? Or?
Correct. Some of the projects, like I think the range one, is partly federally funded, and if we're not getting the amounts that we're supposed to have, or that we used to have, it's harder to make up on this with just state money.
Representative Simonson, one thing I did read, though, that transportation policy issues, there have been some new provisions folded into other bills regarding texting, mobile phone use while driving, things like that. Are there some things that viewers and drivers should know about that are coming out of this session?
Right, that's a good point. We did pass a bill that I'm sure will be signed into law that essentially prohibits using your cell phone in a construction zone, whether, well, you know, texting's already illegal, but essentially you wouldn't be able to talk on your cell phone or use your cell phone for any other purpose during the time that you're moving through a work zone.
And that seems like kind of a common sense issue, but sometimes we have to tell people not to do things like that. So, yeah. Representative Murphy, Gary from Cloquet has a question about fundraising for politicians. His question is, do you accept financial contributions from places such as the Fond du Lac Reservation for election campaigns, things like that? I know that'd be kind of an individual legislator question. Have you gotten money from the Fond du Lac tribe in the past?
I have gotten funding from the Fond du Lac Political Action Committee in the past, yes.
And they're an arm of the tribe, is that true?
Yeah, well, I don't know if they're an arm or a finger, or I don't know exactly what it is, but yes, yeah. And there are limits of how much we can accept, and just like there are limits on how much we can accept from any political action committee.
All right, we are almost out of time, so Representative Simonson, let's just give viewers a sense of what's coming next for the legislature. Now you're off for the next week and a half, and then you'll be getting back to work right after the Easter break.
Right. We go back a week from Tuesday into session, and we have some policy bills to finish up, and we need the conference committees to do their work on the tax bill and the finance bill, and then bonding. It's all going to be bonding.
So the bonding bill, not really unveiled yet. We'll probably hear about that as soon as we get back when the session starts back up, Representative Murphy.
I hope so.
All right.
I
Well,
hope so.
I want to thank both of you for coming in this afternoon to be here for Minnesota Legislative Report. And thanks to both of you for joining us today, and to everyone who called in or emailed their questions today. Minnesota Legislative Report will be off next week for the Easter holiday weekend, and will return for our next show on Sunday, April 27th. Make sure to tune in then for that edition of Minnesota Legislative Report. Until then, I'm Greg Grell. Thanks for watching, and have a great evening.